So Brian Cunningham is your presenter today. Brian is the Floodplain Management Policy Coordinator for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. Brian has a statewide responsibility for managing Wisconsin's floodplain program by serving as the primary floodplain zoning policy and enforcement specialist for DNR. He also coordinates the state's national flood insurance program and community rating system. Becky Roberts is the moderator today. Becky is a land use specialist with the Center for Land Use Education. She provides training for plan commissioners, elected officials, and others involved in land use decision-making. She helps Wisconsin communities understand and apply tools related to community planning, public participation, and land use regulation. And Becky will start us off this afternoon.
First, I'll start by unmuting. Thank you all for attending. I really appreciate it. I'm excited for the diversity of participants that we have here. We're actually, Brian, if you'd like to advance one slide, we're actually going to start with a poll just to get a little bit better sense of who is participating today. So you should see a poll pop up in front of your screen, and you're welcome to take part in this. It's a two-part question, and we're interested in knowing what your role is, whether you're an elected official, somehow involved in the realm of planning and zoning, engineering or public works, floodplain management, or other roles, which you're welcome to type in the chat box if we haven't quite captured what your role is. There's also a second question. I know many of you are joining together from a single site. So if there's multiple people attending, just let us know how many are there so we can get a sense of who's online. I did look a little bit in advance at the registration list, and we have a really great mix of, I'd say, about half counties and half cities and villages. And I know we also have a handful of state agency folks, regional planning commissions, and consultants. And so what you do within all of those different municipalities can vary quite a bit. So I'm interested in seeing who we have joining us today. I'll give you just another moment to finish the poll, and then I can share those results with you. All right, it looks like most have participated. So you can see in a pop-up screen, it looks like mostly planning and zoning folks, 81%, along with a bit of floodplain management and engineering, and just a few elected officials and other roles. So thank you all for joining us. I appreciate the diversity of roles that you all play in your communities. So with that, I will go ahead and hand it off to Brian. Brian's our primary speaker, and I'll be joining with a few slides a little bit later in the presentation.
All right, thanks, Becky. Good afternoon. I recognize a lot of names on that's popping up here, so thank you. And the ones that I don't recognize, I'll just give you a little more background. I've been working for Wisconsin DNR for about 3 years now, and it'll be 3 years in October. And before that, I worked in various roles as a zoning administrator, assistant zoning administrator for Sauk County Planning and Zoning Office. So many of you know me through that role, and I have been in your guys' shoes, and so hopefully that will help me relay the floodplain message to you guys. Many of you guys do more than just floodplain zoning, and I think back in Sauk County days, I think there were 10 or 12 different ordinances that we enforced. So floodplain zoning is one of the most complicated ones, just because it is complicated, and then you also don't work with it every day. And when you don't work with something every day, it's tough to keep fresh information fresh, in your head. So hopefully, these next 3 weeks, you can learn something, that you guys can all learn something, and we'll go from there. I'm going to shut my video off just so I've been having just issues with my bandwidth, so I just.
And Brian, you just muted yourself as well. So.
Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. All right, get going here. So let me get to the next slide. So today we're just going to basically try to go over what's the goals of a floodplain program, roles of FEMA, DNR, and the municipalities, you guys. That's the basics of floodplain zoning and what additional tools that you have available. So this picture here of the map of Wisconsin shows that no matter where you're located in the state, in the last 30 some years, you have faced a federal disaster declaration. It shows Southwest Wisconsin, those numbers have been hit the hardest, but, everywhere in the state, there has been, a federal disaster declaration. So there's been a lot of flooding and, a lot of issues that come with that. So just wanted to give you, some background on where the flooding has been taking place in Wisconsin. This slide here just shows nationally, there has been a trend, an increase since 1980 of more federal disasters, and just showing the amount of money that is spent during a disaster and how it's been increasing. If you think it's been raining more recently, you are correct. This is just showing in the United States, where the United States has been receiving more precipitation. And this is just another slide that shows the same kind of trends in the last decade compared to decades before, the average precipitation of rain that we've been receiving nationally. More at a local level, I listened to Monroe County Climate Change Task Force. Bob, who's the land conservation director there, did an excellent presentation, and he shared some of his slides with me. And it's just not that we're getting more rain. It's just the more rain, the rain we do get, it seems to be more intensified. So just just to showing the damage in Monroe County in the 90s, we had showing that approximately $30,000 worth of damage, and then the last 10 years, 12 years, 33 million, and how that number has increased. And then the other slide showing that average in an average year we get roughly 33 inches of rain, and then in 2018 we doubled that almost in Monroe County. And then in the lower left there of that number showing that in what 2 or 3 weeks in 2019 we received 4 to 5 inches and an inch of rain and 6 to 7 inches in 2 hours. So just the intensity of the rains, it's changing our landscape and what happens when it rains, and the flooding that we receive with that rain. Just some pictures in Monroe County showing some of the problems that happen after the rain events. The PL 566 flood control structures, to have 6 of 7 of them overtopped and 3 breached in one watershed. Historically that hasn't ever happened since those structures have been placed. Closer to where I live and, like I mentioned, worked, the 10 highest river stages recorded on the Baraboo River in this that happens. These pictures here in the village of Rock Springs, and upstream in the city of Reedsburg, there's a river gauge there. And if you would look at the history of that river gauge, the 10 highest river stages have occurred since 2008. So it just showing another example of another county experiencing a lot of rain events and a lot of flooding. So why what you're here today is what is floodplain management? So floodplain management is a kind of a partnership between 3 regulations. We have the federal, the state, and the local. If you can think like the federal regulation, the 44 CFR, that's kind of like your guys' building code. So, many of you have a UDC, a building permit that you issue or you subcontract that work out. So that's kind of the federal regulation is kind of like the floodplain UDC part of it. It talks about how to build in the floodplain, what to do in the floodplain. And then you have the state regulation, and the state regulation is more of a zoning ordinance, permitted uses. And then we have the local ordinance, and that's what you guys enforce. So we have a model ordinance that kind of combines the UDC part of the floodplain and the zoning part of the floodplain, and it's combined together to form your local ordinance. So we have a model ordinance out there. You do not have to use it, but it is out there, and many of you do have the same language as the state model ordinance. And the idea is the same for all of them. Is we're trying to prevent flood losses and to avoid as much flood losses as we can during flood disasters. So, the purpose and intent, this is all in your guys' ordinance, to protect human life and health, to minimize prolonged business interruptions, and to minimize damage to public facilities and utilities. So, after a flood, if a community is well prepared, how long is it until they get back up on their feet running? It really depends on how much floodplain you have in your community and what kind of regulations you have in your community. So to give you some background of the National Flood Insurance Program, it's been around for over 50 years. We have 565 communities right now of 622 that have mapped floodplain that belong to the National Flood Insurance Program. And the National Flood Insurance Program is kind of like a carrot and a stick approach. The carrot is they will provide flood insurance to communities and to residents that belong to the National Flood Insurance Program. And you don't have to be in the mapped area to receive that benefit. Anybody that belongs to the community can get flood insurance. And FEMA's data, FEMA slides and data will show that 25 to 50% of their damages occur outside the map floodplain. So it's important that just not the people that are in the map floodplain get insurance, but also those that are outside of it. And then the stick approach is the community has to adopt and enforce the regulations. And that's kind of the relationship between the two programs. So the federal role will, like I mentioned, provide the flood insurance. They provide the maps, and they have that UDC portion of it on the floodplain standards in 44 CFR. And they will help inform and educate the public and provide technical assistance. So, we try to advertise anytime there's webinars at the federal level, but you just have to be careful when you listen to them. They're just speaking to that, that Uniform Dwelling Code portion of the floodplain. So it can be confusing when you listen to a FEMA webinar, just because they're not talking about Wisconsin. They're just talking about the NFIP minimums. So if you do attend I encourage you to attend their webinars, but just keep that in mind that what I say and what you hear will be a little bit different than what you hear from FEMA, just because we are different than them. Here's an example in 44 CFR 60.1 sub D, where FEMA really encourages communities to have higher regulations. So I mentioned that we have a model ordinance. A lot of communities in the southeast part of the Wisconsin, that some are on the call today, they have an ordinance that's even have higher standards than the model ordinance, and really limit development of all floodplain developments, just not in the floodway. And we'll get into those districts in a little bit here. But FEMA encourages, to have higher standards. The higher the standards you have, the cheaper, the residents' flood insurance are going to be. The further away you are from a flooding source, the higher you build, are going to help with those insurance rates. And we have the state role too. So we provide technical assistance, trainings like today. We do what they call audits, community assistance contacts and visits. They're called CACs or CAVs. FEMA also does those to communities. We help with the remapping process to provide more maps. We review and approve community ordinances. So as you get new maps, you have to adopt those maps and then the language that comes with it. So that's what our session 2 is going to focus on, is that process of review and approve of communities' ordinances. I believe, like I mentioned, we have 640 roughly communities. Like 200 of those communities in the next couple of years are going to receive new floodplain maps. So there's going to be a lot of communities adopting new ordinances, and we'll be helping with that. So we have to approve that, and then FEMA also has to approve anytime you do an ordinance. And like I mentioned, that's going to be our topic for next Thursday. And we do, like I mentioned, provide an ordinance, and we'll go through that next week. And then we inform and educate the public. We have 11 water management engineers throughout the state. There's a couple on the call today. And I guess Will and Ryan are on the call. If you could unmute yourself and just introduce yourself. Will, if you want to go first, and just mention what area you cover. And these WMEs are there to contact. This should be your first contact when you do have questions. Like I mentioned, you don't look at this ordinance every day, so it's tough to keep up to speed and understand it. And so these 11 water management engineers are here to help you until you get comfortable with your ordinance. So Will, if you want to go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. My name is Will Disser. I'm the water management engineer covering the South Central counties in Wisconsin. So Green Lake, Columbia, Dodge, Dane, Jefferson, and Rock. So if you're a member of one of those counties or one of the communities in those counties, I would be your primary point of contact for that floodplain zoning technical assistance that Brian was talking about.
Thanks, Will. Then Ryan, are you on?
Yes, sir. Hello, everyone. I'm Ryan Jarvis. I'm an engineer of the Eau Claire office. I cover Buffalo, Clark, Jackson, Price, Taylor, and Trempealeau counties. Just as Will said, if you ever have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Sometimes if they're more complicated, I'll end up bringing Brian in along with those discussions, but I am your first stop.
Thanks, guys. So, these to me is, what you see here, there, we do provide, we'll have a link where you can use that link to get in contact with your water management engineer. And like I said, these people, definitely reach out to them and use them to help enforce your ordinance and until you get, familiar with it, because it is a complicated program. So some of the, the local role is that, you do adopt and enforce a floodplain ordinance and the maps. So floodplain zoning is a little different than like a chapter 30 permit. Working in the water, like most of the communities that are on the call here, you have jurisdiction on the ordinary high and landward for, shoreland zoning, and you are the permit authority for shoreland zoning. Well, floodplain zoning is the same thing, is you have the authority, but you also have the authority in the water. So there's no permit that's issued from FEMA for floodplain, and there's no permit that's issued at the state level for floodplain. It all is issued at the local level. So so it's, it gets confusing because, you think about the ordinary high water mark and the landward for floodplain zoning, for shoreland zoning, but for floodplain zoning, you have the jurisdiction in the water also. So you are the permit authority. You're there to issue the permits in the special flood hazard area, that mapped area. You want to require the elevation data for the structures. And in session 3, we're going to go through, a permit application and what you should require for elevation data and go through some of that. You need to provide the flood zone determination. For most of you, you have permitted uses in a certain district, and we'll go through those. So you have to determine what district they're in. One of the toughest parts of your job is doing substantial damage and substantial improvement determinations. And when you have a flood like this picture is showing, to go through that and go looking through each one of those structures to determine are they 50% damaged or not, and to do those inspections and the violation follow-ups. I mean, if you look at this picture here, this in the center, lower center of the picture, you see there's 2 or 3 houses there that are built on fill, and then the other houses are not. So you wonder, what triggered them to be built on fill. Did they have a 50% improvement where then they had to upgrade their whole structure? They probably were not happy with this community's zoning official when they had to do this, but I bet you when this picture was taken, they were pretty happy. They did elevate. So each one of you that belong to the National Flood Insurance Program, you have a resolution somewhere on file, or FEMA has a copy of this resolution. And basically it says that you agree to have a floodplain management program, and that you agreed to issue floodplain permits in that special flood hazard area. And then in return, FEMA will provide the flood insurance and also, certain disaster reliefs because you belong to the National Flood Insurance Program. As I talk today, and as you hear other people talk about the floodplain, there's the definitions and certain words that you'll hear us talk about, and just wanted to go through just what some of those are. So if you hear me say a floodway, that is where the water is moving. Most of you have ordinances that have permitted uses that are in the floodway versus the flood fringe. So flood fringe is where the water is standing, and a zone AE means a floodplain zone with elevation. So anytime you see that E, that means we know that there's an elevation. And then the zone A is approximate area. We don't know what the elevation of that floodwaters is. So that is an approximate study. So you might wonder, why do we have so many different kinds of maps out there? Well, when FEMA put this program out 50 plus years ago, they didn't have time to do, or the money to do, detailed studies on every watershed. So some of you out there have, I know like Vilas County, their whole county is zone A. They don't have any zone AE. So some of you have all of them, and some of them you just have one or the other. And then on the right here, on the right hand column, these all mean the same thing. So in one sentence, I'll say the 1% chance flood, and then next I'll say it's a 100-year flood, and then I'll talk about the base flood elevation, then I'll say the regional flood elevation, and then I'll say the special flood hazard area. They all mean the same thing. And there's really not a good way to explain to someone at the counter, any of these terms. To me, I've, a 1% chance, a 100-year flood, it's hard to get that across at the counter when you're working with the customer. To me, what hits home is, many of you and your customers have a home mortgage, and, to say that you have a 26% chance of that structure flooding during a 30-year mortgage, to me, that hits home more than, any of these other ways to describe, the floodplain that you enforce. So the definition of development. So like I said, you have that affidavit with FEMA that says that you're going to issue a permit for all development. And development includes filling and grading. It just doesn't talk about, building a house or building a shed. Anytime there's filling and grading being done, you should be issuing, a permit. And, some of you have a permit application that covers filling and grading, and some of you rely on your uniform dwelling code building permit, and then it gets a little more fuzzy on how to issue that permit for filling and grading. So this is just a picture of a floodplain. So a floodplain is made up of two districts, the floodway and the flood fringe. Now sometimes we don't know where those two districts are depending on what zone we're in, if we're in that zone A versus AE. And this is just a picture showing, a real life valley aerial photo. So, that floodway is where that water is moving. So if you're looking at these FEMA maps, you'll see this hatched area. That's the floodway where the water is moving. And that flood fringe is where the water is standing. So this is what a firm map looks like. It can be kind of scary the first time you look at this. There's a lot going on. So this is an example where, if you do have, if a development taking place in this area or next to it, please reach out to your, regional management engineers, to your water management engineers, to figure out what to do, because, they're a little scary. There's you see a squiggly lines, you see letters, you see numbers. What does all this mean? So, you want to break this down and try to figure out what's going on here. And until you look at this a few times and understand it, it takes a while. So we'll go through an example of this. Some places that you can look at those maps, the Wisconsin DNR Surface Water Data Viewer. FEMA has a couple different sources to look at floodplain maps. And I recommend that you look at, your US or your local GIS mapping, just because you have your tax parcel maps with that. So if you can use, especially, villages that don't have your own GIS department, if you can look at, use your county's GIS and turn on the floodplain mapping layers, and then you have your tax parcel numbers to go with it and the property lines. But these are different sources to look at to determine what your floodplain maps. I think I have a picture of this later on. I guess I'll talk about it just now, but I'll mention again. But there's also other maps that FEMA doesn't include. So if you think about hydraulic shadows, dam hydraulic shadows, or flood storage maps, those are not going to be on the federal site. So that's where it'd be more important to look at your local GIS or the Wisconsin DNR Surface Water Data Viewer. So this is an example here where you just kind of want to break it down. We'll start on the left side of the map. So you have the hatching, and this is the floodway. You have this letter AJ in this cross section. So that is a cross section where we know the known elevation of the floodplain. And this cross section is going to be in a book called the FIS. It's a flood insurance study. And from that study, you can get the exact regional flood elevation. And you can see this is a zone AE. So we have a floodway, we have a flood fringe. The flood fringe is the dotted lines. And then in the middle of this picture, we have an example of a zone A floodplain. So you could have a zone A flowing into an AE. Now the zone A, you see there's no cross sections, there's no letters, there's no numbers, because it's an approximate. We don't know the elevations. And then we have a zone X and a shaded zone X. Now the shaded zone X is a 500-year floodplain, and a zone X is just beyond the 500-year floodplain.
Ryan, I have a question here, actually, based on looking at the local floodplain map for my community. My community does not have the shaded zone X. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, sure. So a shaded zone X is the 500-year floodplain. There's no requirement in the state of Wisconsin or NFIP to enforce the 500-year floodplain. So I'm not aware of any community that enforces the 500-year floodplain. And then the unshaded zone X, it would be higher ground that's even higher than a 500-year floodplain.
So I'm curious then, could a community also map additional flood hazard areas that maybe would be like the 500-year floodplain or some other locally designated area, and then choose to regulate that?
That is a really good question. You'd have to be a little careful. There's a state statute. It's 8730 sub 1R. I don't have the state statute in front of me right now, but it says something like counties are not allowed to have flood zoning requirements outside of the floodplain. So you'd want to check with your corporation council to see if you wanted to enforce floodplain zoning outside the map floodplain. If you'd be violating that state statute, you might have to maybe enforce that through more of like a subdivision ordinance versus a floodplain zoning ordinance, but that would be a good question for your corp council. It's just a one sentence in the state statute, so it's not very clear. So that'd be something, if a community is interested in enforcing beyond the map floodplain, you'd want to check with their legal counsel.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, no problem. I'm just going to go back to this picture here. And I just want to point out, if you see this 681 here, the squiggly line, FEMA, for some reason, wants to confuse you and me. And this squiggly line means it's rounded. So if you ever get a BFE or RFE, remember they mean the same thing, a base flood elevation or a regional flood elevation. If you ever get a rounded number on your plot plan or on your permit application, you definitely want to, that should be a red flag, because this squiggly line means it's rounded. You should have decimal points. To get decimal points, you're going to use these letters and these cross sections. So I just wanted to point out that anytime you see a squiggly line, that number is rounded, and that number is just giving the approximate elevation. It's not giving you the actual elevation. So I just wanted to make sure point that out. So it's hard to see here, but we also have squiggly lines here. So these squiggly lines are rounded and should not be used. So just wanted to point out that you want to use that big FIS book to actually come up with the elevation. And here's the picture of in Eau Claire here, an example of that FIS. And that's going to show the actual floodplain elevation. So your surveyors and your people that are creating your plot plans should be using the FIS. Here's an example of that FIS. So on that cross section, was an AQ, I think it says, you have this 657.9. So on the cross section, it actually lists what the elevation is. So you notice this line is not squiggly. It's actually, if you have the number of the cross section, it'll actually tell you what it is. And then if you go up to your next cross section, it's 658.3. So let's say you have a site in this zone A here on the north part of the floodplain. You have to use the FIS and the profile and the cross sections to come up with your floodplain elevation at a site if you're between cross sections. So it sounds a little scary. Once you work with your water management engineer and come up with one a couple times, you'll get it down. And like I said, that's what we're here for. And I wouldn't stress out a whole lot. I mean, you want to be as accurate as possible. But if you're, let's say, someone's building a zone AE and you come up with an elevation of 658.5, and there's a audit done or a violation, and FEMA comes in and says, "Oh man, that elevation really measures out to be 658.6." They're not going to stress out about that. The violations that I've worked with FEMA, they're going to honor your elevation as long as you show how you came up with that elevation. They're going to honor your number. It's your program and it's your ordinance. So when I have worked with FEMA in the last 3 years, they will support the number that you come up with. So just don't stress out about coming up with the wrong tenth. You of course you want to be as accurate as possible for your customers, but don't stress out that you came up with a half point difference or a point. So we just talked about those two cross sections, and then it shows how far they are, how wide they are, and what the elevation of those two cross sections are. And so then you use these cross sections to come up with the BFE. And this is just showing when you're between, here's a cross section, and then you'd measure from a known point. So those cross sections, let's say the house that's being built is 1,000 feet upstream from that cross section, then each one of these squares you'd measure up until you come to your location, and then you would go straight up to the 100-year floodplain, and then you go across to get to the BFE. And you see there's several different lines on this graph, and you want to see that there's a 0.2, that's the 500-year floodplain. There's a 1% chance, that's the 100-year floodplain. So you just want to make sure you go to the right legend into the right column. So like I said, our water management engineers will work with you if you have a floodplain permit that comes in and the client is giving you a BFE that it's just not making sense to you. always reach out to us and we can help you come up with that BFE. Just wanted to touch on another zone. There's a new zone called the VE zone. So any community that's on the coastal of Lake Michigan and Lake Superior is going to get this new VE zone. And what it does is it takes the base flood elevation of the Great Lakes and it also adds storm waves to it. I think they modeled like 100 storms coming from different directions with different lake levels, and they determined the wave that splashes up on the land, and that's also going to be part of the floodplain maps. And I have a new maps coming out, and they're not all coming out at once. So these were the first 3 counties that are receiving those new floodplain maps.
Brian, I do have a question there. Is there a process or timeline for other coastal counties who might be interested in getting a jump start or learning more about this?
Yeah, so basically FEMA, how they get maps out is there's so much money each year that they allot to each states, and FEMA themselves don't make the maps, they subcontract it out. So each subcontractor is working on a county to come up with the floodplain maps. And because the county only has this LFD, means letter of final determination, it takes years to establish these maps, but then once they establish them, they only give the community 6 months to adopt these maps. Otherwise, they get kicked out of the National Flood Insurance Program. And sometimes, they'll audit you before you can get back in. So you do not want to miss this deadline. And being that we have so many communities that are going to be getting new maps, they stagger it. They don't, because you only have 6 months, they stagger the timing of these. So along Lake Michigan, most of the counties, it looks like to me, will be being adopted this year, 2023, with maybe a couple counties early 2024. And then up in Lake Superior, those 3 or 4 counties will be mid to late 2024 to early 2025. There is a project manager for each county. So if a county's wants to know more about their floodplain mapping process, I can get you in touch, or your local water management engineer can get you in touch with a floodplain mapper that is managing your county. I do have a slide here that just shows. So when I mentioned that FEMA is subcontracts all their mapping projects out, the DNR has a mapping staff that also picks up those subcontracts. So here it shows where the DNR is working for FEMA to remap their floodplain. And like I mentioned, there's managers for each one of these. There's 3 or 4 managers that cover all these counties and these projects. So I can get you in touch with that floodplain mapper manager to let you know where they are in the mapping process. And again, this is just the DNR projects. These are not subcontractors, private consulting firms of other FEMA contractors. So as you notice, so most of the counties along Lake Michigan are being subcontracted out through private firms, not the DNR. So they're not highlighted. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. And I'll note in the chat box, someone piped in that Waukesha County and affected communities start April 19th of this year. So
okay. Thank you. Yeah, that's going to be a big one. I think there's, I want to say like 30 communities in Waukesha County. So that's that's a lot of ordinance reviews to review and approve for FEMA. This is this example of what that coastal area is going to look like. So it's a 3-foot wave is the VE zone. So they're modeling that 3-foot wave and how that 3-foot wave hits the shore. And then less than the 3-foot wave is the AE zone. So this area, this is kind of completely opposite of how you've been trained to be a floodplain manager. The coastal area, this VE zone, there is no floodway or flood fringe. So there is no permitted use or not permitted use. So a structure is permitted in the VE zone. It has to be built on stilts or pilings. So it's a complete opposite of what we're used to with riverine flooding. Because you think about where these waves are hitting, you don't want fill there because that fill is going to get washed away. So federal requirements, FEMA doesn't allow fill for structural support if you're in this wave zone. And so it's the opposite of riverine flooding, where if you're building the flood fringe, you have to build on fill. In the AE zone is, you can think of that as like the flood fringe area. So that area can be built on fill, and that area would be treated like a flood fringe zone, and would be, I guess, yeah, this would be the same. And the AO and the AH are just if you picture the wave going over top of a bank and then flowing down into an area that's trapped, that's kind of what an AO AH zone is. Like I mentioned before, there are other floodplain maps that are out there that communities have to enforce. The dam failure analysis is an example, and flood storage is another example. So any large dam has to have a dam failure analysis. And so let's say you have a FEMA floodplain map, and then you have the hydraulic dam failure analysis. You have to use the higher standard of the two of them. And just have a picture here showing in the state of Wisconsin where all the dams are located. So you can see, there's a lot of dams in Wisconsin. Only the large dams have to have that DFA in them. The Wisconsin minimum standards, some of these standards, so these are what exceeds the FEMA standards. So we require 2 feet of freeboard. So you'll hear this 2 feet of freeboard. Flood protection elevation you'll see that in your ordinance. That means you build to the BFE or RFE plus 2 feet. If it's a new structure, you have to have 15 feet of fill around that house or that commercial building, and that has to be 1 foot high. And you have to have dry land access. You have to, prevent most development in the floodway. That's where the water is moving. You have to look at non-conforming structures. You have to do the 50% rule. There's a federal 50% rule, and there's a state 50% rule. And we'll touch on Act 175 in session 2. And then the zero rise mapping standard is also another higher standard. So, do minimum standards guarantee flood protection. So this was an actual job site that I had in 2008. So you see on the left, that little yellow square that I drew on this map. I'm not zoomed out far enough, but that's the flood fringe. If you were out far enough, you would see that, we see the hatching in the lower part of the left picture here. That's the floodway where the water is moving. And then the light blue is the flood fringe. And that's where you can build if you can meet your standards of your ordinance, for certain communities. There are some communities on this call that would not allow this house this square yellow thing to be built in the flood fringe. But so this structure was going to be built in 2008. They had a soil test done, they had it flagged out, and they were just ready to be built. And they did a really good job of flagging everything out. On the picture on the right, you see that knob in the middle of the picture here, and that knob goes all the way to the road to the north. And so they had a building site, they had enough soil for a septic system, and they were just ready to break ground. And the 2008 flood came, and the floodwaters were 5 feet higher than the ground here. And when the homeowners saw this, they didn't ever build there. So they just said, how could we ever build high enough to protect our investment and our safety? And, I think about, this person that, someday this land will sell, and, someday there'll probably be a house here. It's a gorgeous location, But these maps are just for the 100-year floodplain. What happens when you get a 300-year floodplain or a 500-year storm event? So just when you're at the counter working with people, just let them know that these maps are for a 100-year event. I think my next slide here, talks about high water marks. To me, this is such a huge tool that communities do not take advantage of. I mean, if there was a high water mark on that bridge, so when that, young couple that just gets married and wants to build a house and they're all excited and the land's a little cheaper because it's in the floodplain, when they go out to look at that property and then they see how high the floodwaters were in 2008 and also in 2018 and also in 2019, maybe, they would think twice before they built there. So this is just something, to think about, that you guys know how high water, you guys are the ones that are out in the field. You see where these floodwaters reach, and people forget so easily, so quick on, how high the floodwaters get. And so this is just a tool that I think communities could really use. There's a slide that I seen, I think it was in Denver, or it was out west somewhere. And all through the community, they show the high water mark on these trees as people walk through their sidewalks. And, just as a constant reminder every day of, how high the water can get, and just to have that, that public health and safety reminder, when you're building and issuing permits. I think that leads the next slide to, to Becky, just to, to keep on, talking about that, some
Thanks,
tools
Brian.
to think about.
Brian was gracious enough to let me jump in to talk about a few additional planning tools outside of floodplain zoning. And I was really struck by the last photo he had, because it reminded me of this photo that I oftentimes use with students when I'm trying to explain kind of the range of tools that are needed to address environmental problems. And this is really a historic marker. There's stone markers like you see in this photo here that dot the Japanese coastline, warning future decision makers of poor development decisions. And so if you were to translate this, it says, high dwellings are the peace and harmony of our descendants. Remember the calamity of the great tsunamis. Do not build any homes below this point. So I always kind of just slowly reflect, if it were only this simple, this is really an example of an early informational campaign, if you want to put it in today's terms. Certainly predates modern ideas of zoning and building codes and, other types of tools that we have at our disposal. But even when you plan for and when you warn people about some of these dangers associated with a tsunami or with the 100-year floodplain, that doesn't completely limit our exposure. As we know, we're having more intense storms, more frequent storms. And so we need a range of tools to address those types of issues. Brian, if you could advance one, I'm actually going to use this next screen as a prompt to do another poll. Let me see if I can get back there. Okay, so we have one more poll here. Should have popped up now. So thinking in your community, even beyond floodplain zoning and beyond direct river and stream type areas, what tools is your community using to address flooding? And certainly we have additional types of flooding beyond, rivers or streams toppling their banks. Many of you may be experiencing basement flooding or flooding in your streets or, water ponding in parks. And so there's a variety of tools here that I've listed. And there's a range of community plans. That's one of the options that could include anything from a comprehensive plan to hazard mitigation plan, climate adaptation plans, and the like. Development regulations. Here I'm really thinking about tools like zoning and subdivision regulations, perhaps stormwater regulations. There's a whole suite of green infrastructure tools you might be considering. And then a really important conversation to have is also thinking about infrastructure and how do you finance infrastructure upgrades. And then lastly, public information or incentive type campaigns. And if you have something else innovative or that I've not thought about here, feel free to type your ideas in the chat box. So I'll give you just another moment to complete this poll and we'll see where we're at. So I just got to jump and more people responding. Great, well, I'll go ahead and start it or share the results. So it looks like a very significant portion of you are doing various forms of community planning and mapping, as well as using a range of development regulations. Those are both in the 87% range, and then down 25% and below. A number of communities are using public information and incentives, green infrastructure, and financing tools. So that's great. So if that box continues to show up, go ahead and exit out, and then you can continue to see the full slides. All right, so Brian, if you could advance one more slide. Great. So I'm not able to cover all of the different possible tools, but I just want to give you a fairly large overview here, thinking about how this might play out across a landscape. So when you think about this large landscape or regional scale, in addition to floodplain zoning and different types of floodplain protections, certainly communities are also thinking about wetland protection and restoration, shoreline protection, large forms of land conservation, identifying highly sensitive or maybe higher quality or intact natural resource areas, as well as thinking about how to link those areas through different connections, whether it's a trail or a greenway. These are the types of planning efforts that go on at a larger scale. And it's really critical that we can map these areas and that we can plan ahead and prioritize how we're going to be addressing these areas, because it's oftentimes a matter of intergovernmental cooperation and working not only with municipalities and counties, sometimes at a regional level, private organizations like land trusts, or sometimes state or federal agencies as well. Ryan, why don't you advance one more? Then we think about the municipal scale. And again, I'd say a lot of cities and villages and even counties have been pretty good at thinking about parks and setting aside land for green space within their communities, particularly around lakes and rivers and coastlines. And many more communities are also intentionally designing these parks nowadays to accommodate stormwater and to restore and to allow for the natural functions of wetlands. But also in the urban areas, we have to think, even if something's outside of the floodplain, it's still connected hydrologically. And so addressing the impacts of impervious surfaces and trying to create more green spaces, which could occur through tree canopy. Many communities have tree canopy protection goals or ordinances. And a lot of communities are also building in green street type functions where they're building in swales and waterways and other areas to intercept runoff before it gets directly shuttled to our lakes and streams. Want to advance one more, Brian? And then also there's certainly the site scale. And in part, communities can regulate for some of these things. For example, if it's a commercial development, maybe you're regulating parking lots, or maybe there's some landscaping standards that go along with different forms of development. So including things like vegetated swales, or you can also have voluntary or incentive or educational campaign type ideas as well, where you're promoting rain gardens. Oftentimes this could be paired with communities that have stormwater utilities. So you could be providing credits or actually providing access to rain barrels or to education to help offset some of the development impacts. All right, one more slide. So a good starting point for your community to be thinking about this range of tools is certainly at the planning stage. Thinking about what are the various flooding issues or stormwater management and other related hydrological issues within your community, and thinking about how you can plan for that. Mapping is a huge component of that. And also taking it from the planning stage to the implementation stage is really important. And here I've mentioned the capital improvement plan. How do you go about implementing your plan? Oftentimes translates to what you're choosing to fund within your community. So if you're funding parkland acquisition, or if you're funding a street redesign and some green infrastructure components, oftentimes that originates from a plan, but you need to take it one step further and actually put some resources behind that. So one more slide just shows a typical work program that you'll oftentimes see within a plan. And this is an example from Eau Claire. There's plenty of other examples around the state showing what it is that they're planning to adopt. Here I've got some code and ordinance things that they're working on, the department that's responsible, and how quickly they would like to achieve that. Go ahead and advance, Brian. And then lastly, I can't get into all the tools in detail, but I do want to pause on the idea of regulating floodplains and stormwater through your subdivision regulations. I think so many communities focus heavily on zoning because it's such a common tool in their zoning decisions, which happen frequently. But there's actually, I would say in my view, even more potential to address some of these issues through a subdivision ordinance and through how you're designing your communities and how you're designing new development. This is an example that I took from the city of Brookfield, and I was cued in to look them up because they were featured on the wiki, which is a climate change website. They were cued in as one of the case study examples where they had experienced, I think, about half a dozen 100-year storms in a fairly short period of time, maybe over a span of 20 years. And so I knew to look in some of their regulations because I expected that they were addressing some of the impacts of flooding and stormwater management. So here I pulled just a piece out of their design standards from their subdivision regulations. And what I like about this is that they are including the idea of easements or drainage right-of-ways as part of their development requirements. And they do have a bit of basic information in terms of elevations and how far they need to go. One thing I will point out, based upon some struggles that I've seen happen in a local community, it wasn't in the city of Brookfield, but in addition to including this in your subdivision ordinance and perhaps identifying a right-of-way area on your plat when you're approving a subdivision, make sure you take it one step farther, and that you're also identifying the pre and post development elevations and talking about who is responsible for maintaining those areas. I've seen this go poorly where those types of information were not laid out up front. And so then no one really had responsibility for doing that. Brian, if you could advance that one last slide.
Okay, I just wanted to add a little on this tool. I think this is a very important tool because when floodplains are modeled, the watershed's being modeled outside of the map floodplain area. So you might have an area that has a lot of flood storage, but you don't have a tool to protect that flood storage. So that your subdivision regulation might be a way that you could protect that area so that there's no future development there, or if there is development there, they take in consideration that storage area. So then that model can be, as accurate as possible, and it might, lower the base flood elevations for that area. So
yeah, absolutely. In the community that I was talking about that was struggling with this, you can advance to the next slide because it illustrates this fairly well. They were near a river, but they were technically outside of the map floodplain, but they had a historic area. It had been agricultural for a while before it was developed as a subdivision, but it was clear to the community that it was an area where drainage was occurring and it was headed towards the river. But again, it wasn't directly regulated by the floodplain ordinance. So here's just a last little image I'll leave you with in terms of additional tools. This is the concept of a conservation subdivision and how you can purposefully site development within a given area to avoid a floodplain area or other sensitive resource areas. And sometimes that means including some additional regulations or options within your subdivision ordinance in terms of providing greater density or flexibilities in siting on the portion of the large tract that is more appropriate for development. So I think I will hand it back to you after this one, Brian.
okay, I just I
Next,
know
yep.
we're at time. Just wanted to touch on CRS. We only have 16 communities in the state of Wisconsin that take advantage of CRS, and you can see if your community is interested in that, and if you have a lot of flood insurance policies in your community, again, it's for areas that are inside the mapped area and outside. You could get all the way up to those homeowners could get up to a 45% discount on their premiums. And just showing the different categories of CRS, and we have a lot of additional resources on CRS if you're interested in joining. Part of that process is, having an ordinance that's CRS approved that has the higher standards. And also you would have to have an audit done by FEMA, I believe, to determine, to make sure that you have no violations before you join the program. And I think just wanted to, show that we just had Flood Insurance Awareness Week. Talking about, how we increase precipitation that's taken place. Only 1 inch of water can cause $25,000 worth of damage, and just the awareness of flood insurance that's out there. And I think wanted to get to our questions.
Yeah, well, in case anyone needs to sneak away, I do want to thank you for attending. But we do have 2 questions that have not yet been addressed in the chat box. So if you'd like to stick around for those, or if you want to add additional questions, Brian and I are certainly able to stay on for a short bit to answer.
Yeah, no problem.
I just muted myself. I meant to start my video instead. Apologies. So one of the questions that came in, was from Carrie, and this was about the time you were addressing how residents could purchase insurance even if not in the MAP floodplain. And she was asking, what was the statistic on flood damage outside the MAP floodplain? Does that ring a bell to you?
Yeah, I've seen FEMA, all the way from some of the literature will show 25%. I think it's probably depending on where they're getting their data from. I don't have exactly what Wisconsin is, but I have seen 25%, and I have seen FEMA say all the way up to like 45%. So it's just showing that, what's really sad is when you have a house that's just outside the mapped area. And if you're outside the mapped area, you do not need flood insurance on a loan. If you have a federally backed loan and you're in a mapped area, you have to have flood insurance. So what happens is you have a couple that are outside of that mapped area, and they have a storm event that's higher than 100-year flood, and they get wiped out. There's really no funding for them. Homeowners insurance does not cover floods. So that's where it gets really sad. And according to FEMA, that happens 25 to 50% of the time where this damage is taking place outside of the mapped area.
Great, thank you. All right, so then another question was from Sarah. How often are existing firms updated, and should a community take it upon themselves to remap on their own? So this was asked about the time we were talking about the coastal zone updates, but I think she's asking generally here.
Right. So FEMA doesn't have like a set like every 10 years or every 15. They look at, there's only so much money that they give each state each year, and they kind of determine where those studies should take place. And what they look at is where's the flood damage been occurring in the state? Where's the highest population at? Who's claiming that flood insurance, and who's getting damaged, and are there repeat, damaged properties? So it's more of a formula what they look at to determine where they provide their resources. But as you saw on that map, a lot of the state is being remapped, but you can always, take it upon yourself to invest the resources. If FEMA doesn't, not going to be by you soon, we could try to find that out or bring that to their attention of, if you need, or do you think you do need new maps?
So are you saying that if a community thought they had like much better LiDAR or aerial mapping of some sort, that they could actually remap the floodplain on their own, or does that involve a process of working with FEMA and DNR?
Yeah, they could do that process, then it would, be expensive because they would have to do it themselves, but that is an option. And then, the DNR would look at those studies, or FEMA would review those studies, and they could be adopted into their maps. There's such a thing that's called a LOMAR. It's a letter of map revision, or they can actually look at an area and add a certain area that they seem that's been troubled them, and they can add that to the FEMA map. So it doesn't have to be a county-wide or citywide. It could be just a portion of their floodplain to relook at.
Great. So there was one other question that was actually answered in the chat box, but I'll repeat it for those who may not be able to see the chat box. One person, when you're talking about dams, someone was asking what the definition of a large dam was. And so Mia shared a link and pointed to NR 333.02 for the definition of a large dam.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
I don't know if there's anything else you want to comment on there.
Right. So Mia's a co-worker of mine that she'll actually be doing the presentation for next week on the ordinances. So yeah, NR 33 is the large dam, or the dam section. If there's a further up question, we do also have our water management engineers that know the dam ordinances better than I do.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, so I don't see any other questions in the chat box. I assume that Brian, as well as all of the regional DNR folks, would certainly welcome questions after the webinar.